Everyone, welcome back to Prehab Modem. Today we're going to talk about the shoulders, the anatomy around them, and why they can be so fragile to injury in the sport of motocross and other motorsports and sports in general. The shoulder joint is a very unique joint. It's actually called the glenoid joint. So the joint itself of the ball and socket is called the glenoid. However, this unit in the body is very unique because it's actually only attached to one spot, and that is where your clavicle of your collarbone attaches to your sternum of your chest. So everything else from there is actually free floating. So if we kind of look at it, we have the clavicle of the collarbone running to the acromion process, which is actually a hook off of the shoulder blade. So we have the clavicle and the shoulder blade of the scapula coming together and actually creating the acromion process clavicle joint, or the AC joint as a lot of people are familiar with, because that's a common injury in the sport of motocross because we tend to take that hit into the shoulder. It can pop it and separate the ligaments in there and cause a lot of havoc. So the humerus, being the upper arm bone here, is the bone with the ball to the socket for that glenoid joint itself. Unfortunately, in the sport, there's also the commonality of dislocations of the shoulder. So sometimes if we take a hit and the AC joint doesn't pop, but sometimes the actual ball and socket comes out, that can also be a pretty bad injury and hard to come back from. Typically when that happens, I like to think of it as like an O-ring to that ball and socket. It kind of keeps everything in, so the O-ring sits on the edge of the glenoid joint to help to keep that ball in place so it doesn't go slipping around. Unfortunately, anytime something pops out, something has to give, because structurally in the body, everything is set up to stay in place. So if the humerus, the ball in the humerus, actually ends up popping out, it's going to rip that labrum most of the time. There are instances where it doesn't rip and people get very lucky and it can get popped back in place with minimal damage, just trauma to the area. However, if it pops out and that labrum rips, there's two different types of rips that can occur, or tears that can occur in that labrum. There's a Bankart tear and also a slap tear. Slap tears are a little less common than the Bankart, but that's just the direction of which it popped out and tore, essentially. So usually if you've ever been around somebody that has had a dislocated shoulder, they tend to go out in certain directions more commonly than others. So forward is the most common, popping out forward. That has a lot to do with shoulder posture. So a lot of people tend to have a little bit of a rounded shoulder forward. You can see how that kind of pushes this glenoid joint forward. So if I'm sitting, all day, a little bit rounded forward with poor posture, I go out, ride my dirt bike, and I take a crash in a corner, and the shoulder's already predisposed in that position, and then I take that hit onto it, it definitely is more likely to pop out than if I have good shoulder blade position and I'm sitting with good posture throughout the day, reinforcing the musculature that keeps it in a good place. And we'll talk about the musculature here in a bit. But it's really important to make sure that shoulder gets put in the right place, because it actually lowers the chance of injury for both labrum dislocations and also AC joint separations. The body is a piece of, structural, and it needs to stay where the body is going to be the safest, So that's kind of a weird way of saying it, but it's a piece of art. It really is. So if a mechanical engine isn't running properly and something's sliding and grinding really weird, it's likely going to have something happen to it that's going to throw it off, break it, or need it to get replaced. Unfortunately, for us, that means getting a surgery rather than just, taking out one part and putting in another part. But with the musculature that's around it, there's a lot of musculature because, like I said, this is it's a free-floating joint, okay? So only attachment is right here, okay? So with the attachment to the axial skeleton of the spine and the rib cage is just one spot. Therefore, if it's free floating, it has to have a lot of muscles around it to kind of keep it in place and for it to work properly. Otherwise, we would be seeing, a lot of chicken wings and some weird stuff going on, which people do have sometimes a a wing shoulder blade, that's when you would see those shoulder blades kind of peeking and poking outwards rather than resting flush to the spine. That's also another postural issue that happens back there. But as far as musculature goes, we have a ton of it. So we'll start on the front and we'll work our way around to the back. Front's a little less complicated. On the front, we have the major muscle of the pec major. That's one of the biggest muscles here. It does attach into the humerus and it helps with protraction and pressing forward of that shoulder. We have the pec minor, which runs more upwards, smaller muscle, minor of course, and runs off of the 7th rib down up into the humerus as well to help with a little bit of that forward positioning. Going to the shoulder itself, we're very familiar with the deltoid. So deltoids is actually 3 different muscles. We have our anterior deltoid, our lateral deltoid, and posterior, which just means front, side, and back. So 3 compartments of the deltoid, which aid in 3 different movements of that joint there. Then we go, bicep and tricep do play a slight role in the shoulder, so we can kind of consider them a little bit of a shoulder muscle since they run up into the shoulder, and the bicep actually will aid that front deltoid a little bit in elevation in the front. So the bicep can play a role there, and actually similarly the tricep in the back, because one of those tricep heads, triceps being 3, actually runs into the shoulder blade and can help with retraction of that glenoid a little bit. So tricep, commonly known as a pressing muscle, but it does actually play a role in the shoulder itself. So it's pretty cool. Working our way around to the back, we go to the rotator cuff. So this is really cool because the rotator cuff, commonly we hear about injuries of the rotator cuff. Somebody tore the rotator cuff. What's that really mean? It kind of sounds like they're tearing like one single thing, kind of like I was talking about the labrum. It sounds like it's just one thing. However, the rotator cuff is actually a complex of muscle. So rotator cuff muscles would be more appropriate to say. Starting distally or below, we'll start with the subscapularis, which is a muscle that sits in between the rib cage and the shoulder blade. So it's actually really hard to get to and like palpate. Massage therapists are really good at manipulating the shoulder blade and kind of digging in there. So subscapularis, which helps to keep connection between the shoulder blade, rib cage, and also internal rotation of the shoulder itself. So then we go to the infraspinatus, which is going to be the muscle below infra, and that sits below the spine of the shoulder blade, spine of the scapula. And so if you feel the back of your shoulder blade, you'll feel this ridge, bony ridge. We call that the spine of the scapula. So the infraspinatus sits right below it. Right above it, we have the supraspinatus, supra, over. That muscle right there. That one is the most commonly injured rotator cuff muscle. So most of the time when we hear about somebody tearing a rotator, it's going to be that supraspinatus. It's the uppermost one, and it also runs beneath the acromion process, which is kind of this little hook. So the muscle runs below it, attaches into the humerus, and helps rotate the shoulder joint itself, or the glenoid joint. So when that infra and supraspinatus, since they run so close up there, commonly if the shoulder pops out, or say like somebody throwing a ball, it goes forward, it's going to cause lengthening there and can cause it to pop. So that's the most commonly one. Doesn't mean that the other ones can't get injured. They very much can, but that's a common one that gets injured. The last ones are the teres major and minor. Those actually sit below and under here. Really important muscles. They help stabilize the glenoid and also the shoulder blade themselves. So it's a really good muscle because it kind of connects obliquely or diagonally in between the shoulder blade and the glenoid. Big muscle wise, the lat, which I talked about in my spine video as well. The lat muscle is our pull-up muscle. So if we're doing a pull-up or a chin-up, our lats can engage and actually help to pull our humerus downwards towards the ground. So it starts at the lower back and runs up into actually the humerus to help pull it down, which you can see how that would be a lat pull down or a pull-up motion. So the lat muscle is a shoulder muscle. It is also a back muscle. Gonna learn that a lot of muscles play multiple roles. They're not just one singular thing. Of course, yes, the deltoid is the most commonly known shoulder muscles said, but it can also aid in other things. So muscles play multiple roles in the body, which is the uniqueness of this system that we work with and why it can be so complicated. Getting a little bit deeper into some of these muscles, actually a really important muscle that isn't in the front, the side, or the back, it's kind of underneath here and runs around, is our serratus interior. So the serratus interior is, I call it the wing muscle, a lot of people call it that, or feathers. You might see like a feathery, like 1, 2, 3 type muscle on the side of somebody's rib cage. That muscle is really important because that helps with protraction and stabilization of the glenoid joint in the shoulder blade itself. So if we look at the body from the back and we remove the shoulder blade, what we would see is the serratus interior actually running around to the front side of the rib cage. So it kind of runs on the rib cage, which is what helps us to be able to make this motion forward and back. So a lot going on with the shoulder. Like I said, it is a complex setup, but it's also why injuries occur so commonly there, because it's not as structurally sound as say like the hips are, even though the hips are also a ball and socket joint. The hips are 3 bones on each side that stay together, and then we just kind of plug in those femurs and we got a ball and socket. So it's a lot more stable comparatively to the different types of motion that we can do with this. You know, we can bring it up in flexion, extension, we can abduct it, adduct it, internally rotate, externally rotate, and also circumduction. So we get every bit of range of motion that one could possibly imagine in the shoulder comparatively to say like the elbow joint, which is very much flexion, extension, and mild rotation. Same with the knees. So anytime we open the door for more movement, it also opens the door for potential injuries occurring, because the complexity of that joint and the way that it can move, anytime something can move more, it's more likely to get injured in an impact. And in the sport of motocross, unfortunately, when we take a crash, the shoulders tend to be something that dig into the ground. Of course, there's, you know, the times of bracing where we put a hand out and we'll see broken arms, wrists because of that, and hopefully not, but sometimes people hit their heads directly first and the head takes the hit, and that's when we see those concussions. So really important to have a good helmet, of course. So touching on all that, it is a lot going on there. I'll make sure that I list these out so that I can break them down a little bit more and it can make a little more sense. But the shoulder itself, we'll get into some exercises that can help with stabilization of the shoulder, but also mobilization of the shoulder. Thanks, guys.